Welcome to AP Environmental Science with Miss Grossmeyer. I am your host, Miss Grossmeyer, and I will be doing these short video recordings every week. You'll watch one. It'll be your preview to the chapters, so that way when we come to class on Monday, we'll be ready to jump right into things and get going and learn all about the amazing environment that we live in every day and how we impact that environment. So let's start with Chapter 1. All right, Chapter 1. Studying the state of our Earth. Just ignore that black little line on the screen right about here. That's just on the camera. Don't really know why it's doing that right now. I'm trying to get it fixed. All right, so each chapter starts with an opening case study. The opening case study on this chapter is about a mysterious fish killer and trying to figure out who the stakeholders are along this river and how to address this issue. We will talk about this in class, so don't worry about it right now. We will come back to it. Also, I want to point out that in every single chapter we have this key ideas section right here. That key ideas, as you're going through the chapter, make sure that you know everything that's listed in there. Make sure you're able to explain or describe whatever's mentioned there, so that way you're prepared for the test at the end of the unit. You'll also notice my textbook has a lot of sticky notes in it. This is how I prepare to make these videos. It tells me what to point out, so that way you guys know what to pick up on. Also, with our textbook, there are these checkpoint questions that show up throughout the book. So these checkpoint questions are really important to pay attention to. We also have these big headings to make each section. All right, so our first piece of information that I really want you to pull out from this section is that environmental science is not the same as environmental studies. Environmental science includes how human systems and nature interact. Environmental studies, on the other hand, is more interdisciplinary. So that's looking at law and ethics and policy and all of those other facets that play into environmental science. So the science is just how humans and nature work together. Studies includes everything. In the next section, it talks about humans alter natural systems. What I really want you to pull out is that biotic and abiotic. You should know these terms from your general biology class. Bio means living. A in front of anything means not. So abiotic would mean not living. Should be a review. The other big piece from that section is that as we increase the amount of technology that happens in the world, we're also increasing human population, which increases the environmental impact. So what that means is that as human society figures out ways to grow more food and to live in places that we haven't been able to live before, we're going to increase our human population. So more food means more people. More places to live means more people. But what that also means is that we're impacting the environment on a larger scale. So more technology, more human population, more of an environmental impact. All right, so moving on to our next section, we're looking at environmental scientists. They monitor natural systems for signs of stress. So these signs of stress, we call them environmental indicators. I'm gonna zoom in on this table just a little bit so you can see it better. So the human population is one of our environmental indicators. The human population, again, if we're able to support more humans on the planet, we'll probably have a healthier environment, to a point though. All right, one of the big ones is species diversity, so the number of species on Earth. So we talk about that in chapter 5 and 18. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, zoom back out here. When we look at biodiversity, there's a lot of pieces that go into it. Genetic diversity, if we have more genetic diversity, that means that we have a greater, or that species has a greater ability to respond to changes in the environment. So if there are a whole big variety of colors of birds for a particular species, that means that if for some reason all of a sudden the environment changes and if they have red feathers, they're no longer able to survive, that species as a whole, because it has a big variety, maybe they have brown and kind of a bit more of an orangey colored feathers. So we have some that don't fit that bright red anymore. Those are able to survive. So as a species, they're able to keep living because they have more genetic diversity. I'm not going to talk about this table too much right now, but you need to know this table. You all have a textbook. You need to know the 5 key global environmental indicators. Make sure you know all 5 of them. Make sure you know the trend. Make sure you know what that trend actually means. This will pop up on a test or quiz. So make sure you know that table. All right. So kind of moving on a little bit, habitat destruction and habitat degradation, these are some of the major sources of extinction. So if we're destroying the places that an animal lives, it's not going to be able to live there anymore. It probably has a very narrow range of places it can live, so it's going to go extinct. Makes sense. You guys should have that idea already. All right, we are going to do some math in this class without a calculator. I know it sounds scary, but you'll be okay. We'll go through it step by step together. All right, I am not going to talk about the food production right now. We will come back to it in later chapters, but just kind of know how we grow our food influences where people live and how well people live. We do know that if the total amount of food that we are producing has been constantly increasing throughout time, but if total production is increasing, why, when we look at total amount of food per capita, so per person, why has it leveled off? Things that we think about in environmental science is the soil healthy? How are we using human labor? How much energy are we using to produce that food? Is there any kind of drought or flooding or disease that's impacting this? So we look at any problem from multiple angles. In this class, we're also going to focus on climate change. And one of the largest drivers of climate change is carbon dioxide. All right, so many of the big sources of anthropogenic. Anthropogenic is a huge vocab word in this class. It means caused by humans. So one of the major sources of anthropogenic carbon dioxide is burning fossil fuels and also cutting down forests. So while we're not necessarily burning that wood, it's no longer able to take carbon out of the environment. So we're considering that a source of anthropogenic CO2. I'm gonna move this sticky note up just a little bit. All right, so the basics of the greenhouse effect. Let's see here, there we go. You'll need to know the basics of it. You'll need to know as the solar energy comes in, so as it comes in right here, it goes through our greenhouse gases to the earth. And when that ultraviolet light hits the earth, it warms up the temperature. Some heat is reflected back up towards the atmosphere, and our greenhouse effect, so our good greenhouse gases, they help keep that heat near the earth, so that way the earth stays warm and acts like a nice cozy blanket. Some of that heat does escape, but as we're having more and more greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere, we are having more and more heat reflected back towards the earth, and that's causing some problems. All right. In this class, we will talk about human population. Human population is growing exponentially. That means it's growing really, really fast. You guys should know that from your math classes, but just want to remind you of it. We'll talk about it more later, but just knowing it grows fast. All right. When we look at the way that we use fossil fuels and the way that we use natural resources, this table up here is talking about how we do that, comparing developed and developing nations. So from your social studies classes, you should already know that a developed nation would be a place like the US or Japan or Germany. Those are some of our classic examples of developed nations. Our developing nations, that would be a place like Colombia or Brazil or South Africa. Well, South Africa is not a good example. Maybe something more like Nigeria would be considered a developing nation. So those are places that tend to have more of a subsistence type of society, not necessarily as many modernized resources. There's not as much access to the typical amenities that you would find in a developed nation. So this graph talking about how we use our resources. So paper in the developed nations we use a lot, developing only a little. Automobiles and trucks in a developed nation, most people in a developed nation own or have access to an automobile. In a developing, not so much. All right, so moving onward. Again, we will do math without a calculator. It's okay, we're not going to do it in this video. Kind of the theme of this class is living sustainably and finding ways to live lightly on the earth. So you will need to be able to pull out from this chapter how the use of natural resources on Easter Island led to its decline. When you're doing your reading, this section talks a lot about it. There's also some beautiful pictures of the statues on Easter Island. All right, so just make sure you read that part. Part of the decline from Easter Island is resource depletion, so using resources faster than they can be replenished. In doing so, two kind of major solutions that we'll talk about throughout this year is developing substitutes to whatever it is that you're using. So if you're trying to build a building with some steel beams, maybe the resources needed for that are starting to become hard to access, so finding something that you can use instead that is more renewable. Another method is recycling, so using things multiple times. In one of your first days of school, we are doing an eco-footprint calculation. So an eco-footprint, trying to figure out if everybody lived the same way that you live, how many planet Earths would it take? We're going to do this in class together, so don't worry about it too much. Now, with the next section of the chapter talks about the scientific method. Really, you guys should know the scientific method by this point in time, but if not, this figure right here, this figure is a great example that the scientific method is not linear because you see this little loop back. So the first thing a scientist do, look at the world around them, try to figure out what's going on, develop a question about it. And then once they have that question of saying, I wonder why birds always fly south in the winter. Not all birds, but why do the Canada goose, why do they fly south in the winter? All right, so let's form a testable hypothesis. And the key to this is that it is testable. All right, so can we test it? Can we find a way to prove it correct or prove it wrong? So that could be perhaps they fly south because internally they can sense it getting colder. So you design an experiment. So you're like, all right, I'm going to look at Canada goose. I'm going to expose them to colder temperatures, see if that triggers them to start flying south. Compare that to a group that I keep at a neutral temperature, compare it to a group that I put at a steadily increasing temperature. You guys get the idea. So you develop that experiment, collect your data, look at your results. Do your results support your hypothesis? So is your hypothesis accepted, or do they not support it? Then you reject your hypothesis and think of something else. All right, so it's a constant loop. Your science is never truly done. There's always more questions to ask. All right, a null hypothesis and a hypothesis. I'm not going to talk about it right now. Make sure you know the difference between it. Make sure you know what makes a good experiment. I'm sure back in middle school you saw the example that's right up here with the accuracy and precision. Just make sure you know the difference. Kind of review through this part. I don't expect you to take a lot of notes on this section. You should already remember it, but just jotting down some brief ideas about what's going on. In environmental science, it's very difficult to do a controlled experiment because there's so many variables to consider. So there's things that are called natural experiments where you're just looking at and observing the natural world over a long period of time. So a natural experiment example could be if there was a volcano that erupted and that volcano wiped out all the trees in a particular area. And then you're looking at, well, how does the forest grow back after that has happened? So it's very different from a controlled experiment where you can control all the variables. In a natural experiment, well, you don't know. Maybe another volcano erupts shortly after. Maybe there's a developer that comes in and goes right alongside that particular study area. You never know what's going to happen. Perhaps now another natural disaster influences your results. It's really difficult to control all the variables. Environmental science also has some very unique challenges, one of which is that lack of baseline data. We don't have another planet Earth to compare to, so we don't know what the Earth would look like if humans weren't messing around and causing all sorts of trouble. All right, and also there's no real standard of what does a quality, healthy environment look like. So there's nothing to really say, yes, this is the healthiest and this one's slightly less healthy. Can't really tell because we don't know. We don't have much to compare it to. The last little bit of information, and we'll talk about this more in later chapters, is environmental equity and environmental justice. Just take note of what the definitions are. All right, we made it through the chapter, but we're almost there, not quite. There is always a working towards sustainability section at the end of the chapter. So this working towards sustainability right here. Make sure you read through that last little bit because it's always a great example of a positive thing where environmental science can get kind of heavy at times. But when we're looking at all of these issues, it's really nice to be able to see an example of something where somebody is doing something well. So make sure you read through that at the end. Whoops, you don't want to see that. So at the end of the chapter, I guess if you paused it and looked at those answers, that's okay. At the end of every chapter, we revisit all of the key ideas. So all of those that were listed way back at the beginning of the chapter are now at the end. So here at the end of the chapter, it explains them a little bit more. So if you're in a time crunch, I understand sometimes it happens. You can look back at this, get the gist of what's going on, but you're still really going to need to read through the chapter to get all of that solid information. There is a preparing for the AP exam multiple choice quiz type thing at the end of every chapter. If you're going through the chapter working through that quiz and you want to know what the answers are, let me know. I can help you out through it, help you kind of work through your answers. There are also some free response sample questions at the end because the AP exam is multiple choice and free response. All right, made it through the first chapter. Congratulations. It's our first chapter in this lovely book. I have some questions for you guys in class when you come back to school on tomorrow. All right, have a lovely rest of your evening.